Do you remember the exact moment your father's car rolled off the highway, and the tires changed pitch on the gravel apron of the lot? That specific crunch and shift in sound as asphalt gave way to loose stone, and somewhere above you a sign built out of neon tubing and painted sheet metal buzzed faintly against the dark, throwing red and yellow light across the hood of the car in pulses timed to nothing you could ever quite predict. Do you remember the particular smell that hit you the second your dad cracked the window? That mix of hot griddle grease, cut grass, and somebody's cigarette drifting from 2 cars over, and the tinny crackle of a speaker box clipped to the driver's door, a voice asking what you'd like tonight in a tone that always sounded a little bit like it was coming from underwater. If you do, you're exactly who this channel exists for. We're not here to just replay the famous headlines and the moon landings and the assassinations you already know by heart. We're here to rebuild the ordinary Tuesday nights, the textures and sounds and smells of the America regular people actually lived inside, one vanished building at a time. If that sounds like your kind of remembering, stick around, hit subscribe, and drop a like so more of these get made. Because today, we're pulling the drive-in restaurant back out of the dark. The drive-in, as most of you picture it, didn't spring up by accident. It came out of a specific practical problem in Dallas, Texas, in 1921, when a former Coca-Cola bottler named J.G. Kirby partnered with a business associate, Reuben Jackson, and opened a place called the Pig Stand along the Dallas-Fort Worth Highway. Kirby's insight was disarmingly simple. Texans had started falling in love with their automobiles, and Kirby reportedly believed that people with cars were too lazy to get out of them, so why should they have to? The Pig Stand let carhops run food directly out to parked vehicles, and the idea spread fast, first through Texas, then across the South and West, riding the same wave of highway construction and cheap gasoline that was reshaping the whole American landscape. By the time you get to the post-war boom, drive-ins had multiplied into the thousands, and one Dallas entrepreneur's fix for lazy drivers had become one of the defining shapes of the American roadside. What made the drive-in different wasn't just that you stayed in the car. It was an entire architecture built around that single design choice, and every piece of it mattered. Picture the building itself first, because it was never an afterthought bolted onto a parking lot. Most drive-ins from the 1950s and into the 1960s were built low and wide, often circular or octagonal, with a flat or gently sloped roof that extended out over the parking stalls in a broad canopy, sometimes called a flying wing roof by the architects who designed them, because it seemed to hover without visible support, held up by thin steel columns spaced just far enough apart that your sightline to the building was never blocked. The walls were often glass on at least 2 sides, floor to ceiling in places, so that from your parking spot you could watch the kitchen crew moving behind the counter, flipping patties on a flat-top griddle, the stainless steel surface throwing back the fluorescent light in a way that made the whole interior look like it was lit from inside a jukebox. The exterior colors weren't chosen casually either. Turquoise, coral, chrome, yellow, and white were common, chosen specifically because they photographed well under both daylight and the artificial glow of neon and fluorescent tube lighting after dark, and because they were visible from a moving car at 45 miles an hour on a 2-lane highway. Now, think about the parking stalls themselves, painted in numbered rows radiating out from the building, or lined up in straight banks facing the kitchen windows, each one just wide enough for a full-size sedan with enough clearance to open your door part way. Bolted to a post at the head of each stall, or sometimes mounted right on a menu board, sat the speaker box, usually a simple bakelite or metal housing with a small paper cone speaker and a push-to-talk button, wired back through underground conduit to a switchboard inside, where an order taker juggled a dozen or more conversations at once, distinguishing your car by stall number alone. You pressed the button. You spoke into a metal grill, and a voice answered back through a speaker that was never quite loud enough and never quite clear enough, so you leaned your head slightly out the window every single time without ever really deciding to. Then came the carhops, and this is where the drive-in stopped being architecture and became performance. In the earliest years, they were often young men, But through the 1950s, the carhop became overwhelmingly a young woman's job. And at chains competing for attention, the uniforms escalated fast. Some drive-ins outfitting their carhops in cowboy boots, others experimenting briefly and famously with roller skates, letting servers glide between cars, balancing loaded trays on one raised palm, weaving through parked vehicles with a kind of practiced, athletic grace that turned a parking lot into something closer to a stage. The tray itself clipped directly onto your partially rolled down window, a metal frame with rubber-cushioned clamps designed specifically not to scratch the glass, and once it was locked in place, your whole car became a private booth, sealed off from the family in the next stall by nothing but a few feet of asphalt, and the low murmur of a dozen other radios tuned to a dozen other stations. And you have to sit with what that actually felt like, because the food itself, the burger in its waxed paper sleeve, the fries in a paper sleeve of their own, the frosted glass mug of root beer sweating in the summer heat, all of it arrived to you inside a bubble of total privacy while you were still, unmistakably, in public. You could see every other car in the lot. You could hear snatches of radio drifting from 3 stalls down. You could watch other families through their windshields, laughing at something you'd never hear the punchline to. Nobody could see you eat. Nobody could hear your conversation. It was the strange, specific comfort of being alone together with 100 strangers, all of you parked in neat rows under the same flying wing roof, all of you separately experiencing the exact same Friday night. But here's the thing people rarely talk about when they get nostalgic for the drive-in, and it's worth sitting with for a minute because it changes what this space actually was. The drive-in wasn't just a restaurant. It was one of the very few semi-public spaces in mid-century America built specifically around teenage autonomy, a place where a 16-year-old with access to the family car could show up unsupervised, be treated as a paying customer with agency, and be seen doing it by every other teenager in town. Sociologists studying post-war youth culture have pointed to the drive-in, alongside the drive-in movie theater, as one of the key physical settings where American teen social life migrated out of the home and the school, and into commercial space, designed explicitly to hold it. That mattered economically too. Drive-ins depended on repeat visits from a customer base that, for the first time in American history, had real discretionary income of its own, allowance, money, and part-time job wages, and the entire physical design, the visibility, the performance of the carhops, the endless cruising loop of teenagers circling the lot before even choosing a stall, was built to hold a customer who wasn't just buying dinner. They were buying a place to be looked at. So when you understand that, the decline of the drive-in stops looking like simple bad luck, and starts looking like the collision of several very specific, very real economic and regulatory forces, one on top of another, through the late 1950s and into the 1970s. The first crack came from labor economics. A carhop workforce was expensive to train, expensive to insure against slip and fall claims on wet asphalt, and almost impossible to scale efficiently, because service speed depended entirely on how many bodies you had running trays in a given 15-minute rush. Then, in 1948, 2 brothers named Richard and Maurice McDonald closed their own carhop drive-in in San Bernardino, California, and reopened it, stripped down to a walk-up window, a radically simplified menu, and a kitchen reorganized around what they called the speedy service system, an assembly line process that could produce a hamburger in roughly 30 seconds, using a fraction of the labor. It was slower to catch on than legend sometimes suggests, but by the time Ray Kroc began franchising the McDonald Brothers system nationally, starting in 1955, the economic logic was undeniable to every operator watching, and it never fully reversed. Speed and low labor cost had beaten performance and personal service on the only metric that mattered to a balance sheet. Layered on top of that came a change in the built environment itself. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, signed by President Eisenhower, funded the interstate system that gradually pulled long-distance traffic off the old 2-lane commercial strips where drive-ins had clustered, replacing slow, sign-lined highway corridors with limited-access freeways, where the only visible commerce was a cluster of exit ramp signs advertising whichever chain had bought space closest to the off-ramp. A drive-in built to be seen and entered directly from a slow-moving boulevard had no answer for a family now blowing past at 65 miles an hour a quarter mile away. Then came the 1970s energy crises, the 1973 oil embargo, and the 1979 shock that followed it, which struck directly at a business model built entirely around customers arriving by car, and often idling their engines for air conditioning or heat while they ate. Land values were rising too, particularly in the suburbanizing metro areas where drive-ins had thrived, making a low, single-story building surrounded by a wide parking apron an increasingly inefficient use of expensive real estate, compared to a denser structure with an indoor dining room, or, eventually, a drive-thru lane requiring a fraction of the footprint. By the late 1970s and through the 1980s, the classic carhop drive-in was closing by the hundreds. A business model built on performance, visibility, and a very specific relationship to the automobile, replaced almost everywhere by the drive-thru window, which kept the car but quietly deleted almost everything else the drive-in had been for. And it's worth being honest here about what was actually gained in that trade, because this channel isn't interested in pretending the past was simply better. Modern fast food is faster in almost every measurable way, often under 2 minutes from order to window at a well-run location, with food safety standards, nutritional labeling, and consistent kitchen sanitation protocols that most 1960s drive-ins, run on thinner margins with far less regulatory oversight, simply didn't have. You are not risking a scratched window from a badly hung tray. You are not depending on a teenager balancing your dinner on roller skates in the rain. The food arrives faster. It's more consistently prepared. And the whole transaction is more accessible to people who, for one reason or another, the mid-century drive-in wasn't always built to welcome as easily as it welcomed others. But something specific was lost in that efficiency. And it wasn't just nostalgia talking. It was a physical design that forced you to be visible in public while eating in private, that gave teenagers a legitimate commercial reason to exist unsupervised in shared space. And that turned a Friday night meal into something you watched and were watched doing. The drive-thru window optimizes for a transaction lasting 90 seconds. The drive-in was built, whether anyone said so out loud or not, to make you want to stay. So tell us, specifically, if you were there. Not just that you remember drive-ins in general, but the one you actually went to. What was it called? What town was it in? And what do you remember ordering the very first time someone's voice crackled through that speaker box and asked what you wanted tonight?